Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of unexpected twists, hidden truths, and the transformative power of love. Enjoy the story. Sarah Thompson pushed open the bedroom door, her perfectly manicured nails gleaming in the dim light. Her first action was to draw back the heavy curtains, flooding the room with bright morning sunshine. "Nick, honey, how are you feeling today?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Nicholas Thompson had just enough time to slide his phone under his pillow before adopting a pitiful expression. "Oh, Sarah, darling, you're so thoughtful," he moaned. "I think I'm feeling a bit better today." Sarah perched on the edge of the bed, her tailored suit barely wrinkling. At 41, she was still a striking woman with auburn hair and piercing green eyes. "Nick, this is getting ridiculous. Let me call Dr. Anderson." Nick's eyes widened in panic. No, absolutely not," he protested, shaking his head vigorously. "I've told you this happens to me occasionally. My blood pressure spikes out of nowhere, and I'm out of commission for a few days. But it always passes on its own, I promise." He reached for her hand, his voice softening. "We've only just gotten people to stop gossiping about how I married you for your money. I don't want them saying you ended up with a sickly husband, too." Sarah smiled indulgently, running her fingers through his tousled hair. At 32, Nick was still boyishly handsome, with a charm that had captivated her from the start. Of course, after 5 years of marriage, she knew he wasn't quite the man he pretended to be, but she loved him anyway. "All right, darling," she conceded. "But if you're not better by tomorrow, we're calling the doctor. No arguments." As she left the room, Sarah's mind was already racing with the day ahead. The company was in the middle of crucial negotiations, and she couldn't afford any distractions. Nick was officially her assistant, but it was more for show than anything else. He knew little about business, but Sarah maintained the illusion that she couldn't manage without him. She paused at the bedroom door, looking back at Nick. He had already picked up his phone again, probably scrolling through social media. Sarah sighed softly. She knew Nick was lazy, that he enjoyed the finer things in life perhaps a bit too much, but she could afford to indulge him in these small ways. After all, he brought a warmth and joy to her life that had been missing for so long. "I'll be home late tonight," she called back to him. "There's a crucial meeting with potential investors." Nick groaned dramatically. "You work too hard, darling. At this rate, I'll waste away here all alone while my wife is constantly in meetings." Sarah chuckled. "Next month should be a bit calmer. Maybe we can even take a weekend trip somewhere." "That would be lovely," Nick replied, his tone brightening. "It's been all work and no play for far too long." As Sarah headed out, she chose not to point out that Nick's work often consisted of long lunches and afternoons spent at the golf course. It was a small price to pay for the happiness he brought her. As Sarah navigated the morning traffic, her mind wandered back to the day she'd met Nick. It had been a typical Tuesday evening, and she'd been driving home from a friend's house, taking a shortcut through the old part of town. The streets were eerily quiet, lined with crumbling Victorian houses that had seen better days. Suddenly, her car had sputtered and died, leaving her stranded on a deserted street illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. The silence had been oppressive, broken only by the distant howl of a stray dog. Sarah had fumbled for her phone, intending to call for help, but to her dismay, the battery had died. Panic rising in her throat, she'd been contemplating making a dash for the main road when she'd heard a voice. "Miss Thompson, is everything all right?" She'd whirled around, her heart pounding, to find a young man standing there, concern etched on his handsome face. "Do I know you?" she'd asked, wary but relieved to see another person. The man had flashed a charming smile. "I work for you, actually. I'm Nicholas Ward. I started in the marketing department last month." Nick had lent her his phone, waited with her for the tow truck, and then insisted on seeing her safely home. Throughout it all, he'd showered her with compliments, making her feel like a desirable woman rather than just a successful businesswoman. "You know, Miss Thompson," he'd said as they waited for the tow truck, "I've always admired how you run the company. You have such a commanding presence in the boardroom." Sarah had felt herself blushing like a schoolgirl. "Please, call me Sarah. And thank you." That's very kind of you to say. Their conversation had flowed easily, covering topics from business strategies to favorite books. By the time Sarah had arrived home that night, she'd felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years. Their whirlwind romance had shocked everyone, including Sarah herself. Coffee dates had turned into dinners, dinners into weekend getaways. Nick had been attentive, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in every aspect of her life. When Nick had proposed after just 6 months, the gossip had been relentless. Everyone assumed he was after her money, that he'd cheat on her within a year. "Sarah, darling, are you sure about this?" her best friend Lisa had asked over lunch one day. "I mean, he's so much younger than you. And let's be honest, he's not exactly in your league career-wise." Sarah had bristled at the implication. "Age is just a number, Lisa, and Nick brings so much joy into my life. Isn't that what matters?" But despite her defensive words, doubt had begun to creep in. The night before their wedding, Sarah had sat Nick down for a serious talk. "Nick, I need you to understand something," she'd said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm 9 years older than you. If you ever want to leave, I'll understand. I just ask one thing. Let me be the first to know. No affairs, no sneaking around. If you're unhappy, we'll end things cleanly." Nick had looked hurt at first, but then his expression had softened. He'd taken her hands in his blue eyes serious. "Sarah, I promise you, I will never ever be unfaithful to you. I love you, age difference and all. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." And despite all her doubts, all the warnings from friends and family, Sarah had believed him. She'd walk down the aisle the next day, her heart full of hope for their future together. Sarah shook herself out of her reverie as she pulled into her reserved parking spot at the office. She had a busy day ahead, and she couldn't afford to be distracted by memories, no matter how pleasant they might be. As she walked into the building, her assistant, Jenny, hurried to meet her, tablet in hand. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," she said brightly. "Don't forget about your lunch meeting with the Andersons today. It's at Chez Louis at 1 p.m. Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with preparations. The Andersons were potentially huge clients, and she'd been courting them for months. Today was supposed to be the day they finally signed the contract. "Thanks, Jenny," Sarah replied, heading towards her office. "Can you make sure the final contract is ready, and perhaps have some flowers sent to their hotel room? Something elegant, but not over the top." Jenny nodded, tapping away on her tablet. "Already done, Miss Thompson. The contract is on your desk for a final review, and I've arranged for a bouquet of white orchids to be delivered to the Andersons this morning." Sarah smiled appreciatively. "What would I do without you, Jenny?" The morning flew by in a whirlwind of emails, phone calls, and last-minute preparations. Before she knew it, it was time to head to the restaurant. Sarah gathered her things, double-checking that she had everything she needed. "I'm heading out now, Jenny," she called as she passed her assistant's desk. "Hold my calls unless it's an absolute emergency." Sarah arrived at Chez Louis early, wanting to ensure everything was perfect. The maitre d' showed her to a quiet table in the corner, perfect for a business lunch. "Would you like anything while you wait, madam?" he asked politely. Sarah nodded. "Just a coffee, please. Black." As she sat there, going over the contract one last time, something caught her eye. There, just a few tables away, was a familiar figure. Sarah blinked hard, certain she must be seeing things. But no, it was definitely Nick. Her supposedly bedridden husband was sitting with his back to her, looking perfectly healthy. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She even pinched herself, wincing at the sharp pain. But the scene before her didn't change. It was undoubtedly Nick, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone Sarah couldn't see. She watched in stunned silence as Nick checked his phone, had a brief conversation, and then stood up to leave. Without thinking, Sarah signaled the waiter. "I need to step out for a moment," she said urgently, her voice barely above a whisper. "If my guests arrive, please tell them I'll be right back." With that, she was out the door, her mind reeling. Was Nick cheating on her? Had everything been a lie? The trust she'd placed in him, the love she'd given so freely, had it all been for nothing? As she followed Nick at a discreet distance, Sarah felt a mixture of anger, hurt, and determination. Whatever was going on, She was going to get to the bottom of it. She'd been fooled once before in her life, and she wasn't about to let it happen again. Sarah's heart pounded as she followed Nick through the streets of downtown. He seemed oblivious to her presence, walking briskly with purpose. She had to quicken her pace to keep up, grateful she'd opted for flats instead of her usual heels today. Nick turned a corner, and for a moment, Sarah thought she'd lost him. She rushed forward, rounding the bend just in time to see him entering an apartment building. It was an older structure, probably built in the 1960s, with a faded brick exterior and window boxes full of bright geraniums. Without hesitation, Sarah marched up to the building. She scanned the list of names by the buzzer, but none of them were familiar. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button for the apartment she'd seen Nick enter. A young woman's voice crackled through the intercom. "Yes? Who is it?" Sarah hesitated for a split second before replying, "I'm here to see Nick." There was a pause, then, "Nick? Oh, okay, come on up." The door buzzed open, and Sarah stepped inside. The lobby was small and dated, with scuffed linoleum floors and yellowing wallpaper. As she climbed the stairs to the third floor, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Who was this woman? How long had this been going on? Her hands were shaking as she knocked on the apartment door. It was opened by a pretty young woman who looked to be in her early 20s. She had long blonde hair and wide blue eyes that looked at Sarah with confusion. "Oh," the girl said, her brow furrowing. "I thought you were here to see Nick." "I am," Sarah replied coldly, drawing herself up to her full height. Despite her anger, she couldn't help but notice how young and vulnerable the girl looked. "Where is he?" Before the girl could answer, Nick appeared behind her. His face paled visibly when he saw Sarah standing in the doorway. "Sarah?" he gasped, his voice a mixture of shock and fear. What are you doing here?" Sarah felt a surge of anger course through her. All the fear, the hurt, the betrayal she'd been feeling since she saw Nick at the restaurant came bubbling to the surface. "What am I doing here?" she repeated, her voice rising. "What are you doing here, Nicholas? I thought you were sick in bed." Nick's expression changed from shock to resignation. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture that Sarah had always found so endearing. Now, it just made her want to scream. "You'd better come in," he said quietly, stepping back from the door. "We need to talk." Sarah stormed past him into the apartment, her eyes darting around, taking in every detail. It was a small, cozy space, filled with mismatched furniture and cheerful artwork. Not at all what she would have expected for a secret love nest. "Well?" she demanded, whirling to face Nick. "I'm waiting for an explanation, and it had better be good." Nick's shoulders slumped as he closed the apartment door. The young woman hovered uncertainly in the background, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Sarah, I can explain," Nick began, his voice soft and pleading. "Oh, I'm sure you can," Sarah spat, her words dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess, it's not what it looks like?" Nick ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture Sarah had always found endearing. Now it just irritated her. "Actually," he said slowly, "it's exactly what it looks like, but probably not in the way you're thinking." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Oh, really? Do enlighten me, Nicholas, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for God knows how long." Nick took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what was to come. Then he turned to the young woman. "Vicky, can you bring Emma out here, please?" Sarah's confusion deepened. Who was Emma? Another woman? Just how deep did this deception go? A moment later, Vicky returned, pushing a wheelchair. In it sat a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with Nick's eyes and smile. The child looked between Nick and Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Sarah," Nick said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is Emma, my daughter." Sarah felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She staggered back slightly, groping for the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. "Your daughter?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Nick nodded, moving to stand beside Emma's wheelchair. He placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder as he spoke. "7 years ago, before I met you, I had a brief relationship with a woman named Melissa. We didn't part on good terms, and I didn't know she was pregnant when we broke up." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. 2 years ago, Melissa and Emma were in a car accident. Melissa, she didn't make it, but before she died, she told the paramedics who Emma's father was. Sarah's mind was reeling. She looked at Emma, really looked at her for the first time. The resemblance to Nick was undeniable. She had his expressive blue eyes, his dimpled smile. But there was something else, a fragility about her that tugged at Sarah's heart. "By then, you and I were already married," Nick continued, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I was afraid to tell you, afraid you'd think I'd been lying to you all along. Vicky is my cousin. She's been helping take care of Emma when I can't be here." Sarah's gaze snapped to Vicky, who nodded in confirmation. "Nick's been an amazing father," Vicky said softly. "He's here every chance he gets, and he's been working so hard to get Emma the best care possible." Sarah's mind was spinning. All those times Nick had been sick or helping a friend, he'd been here, with his daughter, a daughter who clearly needed a lot of care and support. She looked at Emma again, seeing the fear and uncertainty in the girl's eyes. Then she looked at Nick, saw the love and worry written all over his face. It was all too much. Without a word, Sarah turned and walked out of the apartment, ignoring Nick's calls for her to wait. She needed time to think, to process this enormous revelation that had just turned her world upside down. Sarah somehow made it back to the restaurant just as the Andersons were arriving. She plastered on a smile and threw herself into the negotiations, grateful for the distraction. For the next 2 hours, she was the consummate professional, discussing contract terms and future collaborations as if her personal life hadn't just imploded. But as soon as the Andersons left, contract signed and hands shaken, the full weight of what had happened came crashing down on her. Sarah sat at the now empty table, her head in her hands, trying to make sense of it all. Nick had lied to her, yes, but not in the way she'd feared. He wasn't cheating on her. He was caring for a child he'd only recently discovered, a child who needed him desperately. She thought about Emma, about the fear she'd seen in the girl's eyes. She thought about Nick, about the love and devotion that had been evident in every word he'd spoken about his daughter. And then, unbidden, she thought about her own past. 15 years ago, Sarah had been madly in love with a man named James. They had been planning their future together when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. At first, they had been overjoyed, but when complications arose in the pregnancy, James had shown his true colors. "Sarah, be reasonable," he had said, his voice cold and detached. "We can't afford to pour money into a pregnancy that might not even result in a healthy baby. It's better to cut our losses now." Sarah had been devastated. She had fought to keep the baby, using every resource at her disposal, but in the end, the stress and heartbreak had been too much. She had lost the baby, and with it, her ability to have children. The wound was old, but it still ached. Sarah had thrown herself into her work after that, building her company from the ground up. She had convinced herself that she didn't need love, didn't need a family, until Nick had come along and shown her how empty her life had been. Now, faced with Nick's secret, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could walk away, protect herself from potential heartbreak. Or she could open her heart, not just to Nick, but to Emma as well. With sudden clarity, Sarah knew what she had to do. She stood up, gathering her things, and headed for the door. She had a family to see. Nick paced the living room of their shared home, his stomach in knots. It was late, much later than Sarah usually stayed out. He'd tried calling her several times, but her phone was off. Typical Sarah, always forgetting to charge it. He knew things would never be the same after today. Sarah would probably file for divorce. He'd lied to her after all, and Sarah didn't have children of her own. She'd likely want nothing to do with a ready-made family, especially one with the complications Emma's condition brought. Nick loved Sarah. He really did. But if she made him choose, he'd choose Emma. His daughter needed him. The sound of the front door opening made Nick freeze. He heard voices. Sarah wasn't alone. His heart sank. Had she brought a lawyer with her? The living room door swung open, and Nick blinked in surprise. There stood Sarah, smiling widely with Vicky and Emma beside her. "I don't understand," Nick said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's smile softened as she stepped into the room. "It means, my dear husband, that your daughter is going to be living with us from now on. It's not right for children to be separated from their parents." She turned to Vicky. "And if you're willing, we'd love to have your help. With pay, of course." Nick felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." Sarah crossed the room and took his hands in hers. "You don't have to say anything. We have a lot to talk about, but for now, let's just focus on getting Emma settled in, okay?" Emma looked between them, her eyes wide with hope and uncertainty. "Does this mean you want me here?" she asked softly. Sarah knelt down beside Emma's wheelchair, taking the girl's small hand in hers. "Emma, sweetheart, I want you to know something. I may not be your birth mother, but I would be honored if you'd let me be a mother to you. This is your home now, if you want it to be." Emma's face broke into a radiant smile, and she threw her arms around Sarah's neck. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. As Nick watched his wife and daughter embrace, he felt a wave of love and gratitude wash over him. He knew they had a long road ahead of them, but in that moment, he believed that everything would be okay. That night, after Emma was asleep in her new room, Nick and Sarah stayed up talking until dawn. She told him about her past, about the baby she'd lost and the fertility issues that had followed. "I always thought I'd closed that chapter of my life," Sarah admitted, her voice soft in the pre-dawn light. "But seeing you with Emma, it made me realize how much I've been missing." Nick reached out, taking her hand. "I'm so sorry I lied to you, Sarah. I was afraid of losing you, and instead, I almost lost everything." Sarah squeezed his hand. "We both made mistakes, Nick. But what matters is where we go from here. I want us to be a family. You, me, and Emma. It won't be easy, but I think it'll be worth it." As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, Sarah and Nick fell asleep in each other's arms, both feeling that they'd been given a second chance at love and family. 2 years later. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the piece of paper in her hands with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The early morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. A soft knock at the door made her look up. "Mom, Sarah, can I come in?" Emma's voice called out. Sarah smiled, her heart warming at the title Emma had started using for her. "Of course, sweetheart." Emma walked in carefully, her steps still a bit unsteady. She'd recently returned from a treatment and rehabilitation program abroad and was relearning how to walk. At 10 years old, she was growing into a beautiful, resilient young girl. "Mom, Sarah, did I do something wrong?" Emma asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Sarah shook her head, patting the bed beside her. "No, honey, not at all. Why do you ask?" Emma settled next to her, leaning against Sarah's side. "You seem different today." "Dad's worried too. He's been pacing in the kitchen all morning." Sarah chuckled softly, wrapping an arm around Emma's shoulders. "Your dad's always been a worrier, but you're right. Something is different today. The doctor told me something unexpected." Emma looked up at her, curiosity shining in her eyes. "What is it? Is everything okay?" Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Emma, sweetie, it looks like you might be getting a little brother or sister soon. I'm pregnant." Emma's eyes widened, and for a moment, Sarah held her breath, unsure how the girl would react. Then Emma threw her arms around Sarah, hugging her tightly. "That's wonderful," she exclaimed. "I've always wanted to be a big sister." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she hugged Emma back. In that moment, she realized that it really was wonderful. Despite what doctors had told her in the past, despite her age, she was 43 now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the love that filled their home, a love that was about to grow even stronger. "What do you say we go tell your dad the good news?" Sarah asked, smiling through her tears. Emma nodded enthusiastically, taking Sarah's hand as they walked out of the room together. They found Nick in the kitchen, attempting to make breakfast and failing miserably. "Nick!" Sarah called softly. When he turned, Flour smudged on his cheek, she held up the positive pregnancy test. "We're having a baby!" Nick's jaw dropped, and for a moment he stood frozen in shock. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, sweeping Sarah and Emma into a tight embrace. "A baby," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Our baby." As they stood there, holding each other close, Sarah marveled at the twists and turns her life had taken. From a successful but lonely businesswoman to a wife, mother, and now, against all odds, an expectant mother herself. It hadn't been an easy journey, but standing here now, with Emma's arms around her waist and Nick's love surrounding them both, Sarah knew she wouldn't change a thing. Life, she realized, had a funny way of giving second chances to those who were brave enough to take them. And as she looked at her family, the husband she adored, the daughter who had stolen her heart, and the new life growing inside her, Sarah knew that she had been given the greatest second chance of all, the chance to love and be loved, completely and unconditionally.